Greater Phoenix. We can tell our story differently. A new perspective. A different look. Greater Phoenix A to Z.
Good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on when this finds you. Welcome to the Greater Phoenix A to Z podcast. I am your host, Tim Bourcet. Very excited. Today's show is focused on the upcoming holiday known as Dia de los Muertos, or Day of the Dead. And we're just going to jump right into it. Let's get started by introducing our fantastic guest. Joining us for the discussion on all things Day of the Dead is Dr. Mathew Sandoval. Dr. Sandoval is an associate teaching professor at Barrett the Honors College in downtown Phoenix. He is also an ASU Social Transformation Lab Fellow and member of ASU's Chicano and Latino Faculty and Staff Association. He is currently researching the transborder holiday, Dia de los Muertos. He focuses on the holiday's popular history as it is circulated in mass media, art exhibits, tourism, and cinema. He also conducts ethnographic research on large-scale public celebrations of the holiday in Mexico and the U.S. Southwest in order to examine the ways the holiday has developed from ancient Mesoamerican ritual to mass media spectacle. He analyzes issues of performance, transnationalism, interculturalism, race, hybridity, indigeneity, spirituality, and cultural appropriation and commodification. Furthermore, he writes about the way Day of the Dead intersects with his experiences coming of age as a working-class mixed-race Chicano. Dr. Sandoval, thank you so much for joining the podcast, and welcome.
Word, thank you.
I hit all the high-level stuff. You had like 6 degrees on your bio that I withheld. We agreed nobody actually wants to know that whole list. But if you could just maybe share for a minute a little bit more about yourself and your background.
Perfect. Yeah, as you read it, I was like, dang, that's a really long bio. So Dr. Mathew Sandoval, I've been at ASU since 2015. I'm a performance and culture scholar. So that's what I do. That's what I concentrate on. I was born in a small farming village in Montana, northern Montana. My pops is Mexican-American. My mother's white. I've lived in Montana, lived in Nevada, lived in New York City. I've lived in LA, Portland, all before finding my way here to the Valley, which I love, now call this place home. Yeah, Day of the Dead is something meaningful for me personally. It's not just something that I study because it's intellectually stimulating, although it's definitely intellectually stimulating. It's also a very meaningful holiday for me. So I like to say that the intellectual work that I do is highly personal work because it's cultural work and spiritual work.
Absolutely. And it was funny because when the team was meeting to discuss content about a month ago, they had brought up Day of the Dead. We're in Arizona. The Halloween Day of the Dead season is upon us. And so I'd reached out to a mutual acquaintance we know. I said, hey, do you know anybody, who might be able to do this? And they sent me your link. And it's like, yes, this is exactly the person we need. So we greatly appreciate your time.
Yeah.
We'll jump right into this.
Sure.
Thankfully, the listeners don't have to hear me. They're here to listen to you. And so we're going to hit a couple of things for our readers, really broad perspective. What is Day of the Dead? Some of the history stemming in Mexico, then we'll kind of transition into how that impacts us here in the U.S. and specifically Arizona. Lots of celebrations, lots of cool things here. You'll hit on some of the meaning and significance, along with some of the commercialization and appropriation.
Sure.
I know, just as a brief aside, I knew once Day of the Dead was in a James Bond movie.
Game is over.
Yeah, anytime you see it on the big screen, it is officially part of the mass media.
Yep.
So again, I'm going to turn it over to you, Dr. Sandoval.
Sure.
Let's start with the kind of that tee up. What is Day of the Dead? The big overarching question.
Sure. So Dia de los Muertos is a holiday. And when I say holiday, I don't just mean festivity. I mean holiday in the traditional sense. It's a holy day. Dia de los Muertos is a day of spirituality for many people. It traditionally takes place on November 1 and 2, which in the Catholic liturgical calendar is All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day. Although in Mexico and in the U.S. Southwest, Dia de los Muertos runs basically from mid-October to mid-November. It's a seasonal celebration in that regard.
So some roots in Catholicism in the church, but now it has stemmed well beyond that.
Yeah, absolutely. Because people have interpreted it and made meaning of it in their own communities. So sometimes those Catholic roots are very strong. Other times they're very loose. And so you can stretch that holiday out. But at its core, it's about honoring and remembrance. It really is. In a couple different ways. One is just taking time to honor those who you've lost in that particular year. And, as you get older and experience life, you tend to lose more and more people as you continue to grow. So it's a special time of year to honor that. But then it's also significantly an ancestral ceremony. So it's a way of honoring one's ancestors. And I would say to me, that's one of the most important parts. And as Day of the Dead has become more and more popular, both in Mexico and the U.S., I would say that's also, sadly, one of the parts of this holiday that we're losing is the ancestral connection. So honoring those who you probably never knew, whether that's a great-grandmother, great-great-grandmother, et cetera, paying homage to the people who lived a life, did things in this world, and made it possible for you to exist in the here and now. Day of the Dead is that time of year set aside to honor those particular people.
So you kind of hit the roots in Mexico, and that is, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that is where it started.
Sure.
It has branched out. Can you give us a little bit of the history of when it was, formalized, if you will,
Sure.
in Mexico?
Yeah. So Dia de los Muertos, and I'm going to throw an academic term at you, but I'll do my best to explain it. Dia de los Muertos is what we call a syncretic holiday, meaning it's a mixture of two different cultural traditions.
Thank you for dumbing it down for me and any listeners.
You got it. Syncretic. That's your word for the day. So it's a blend. It's a mixture of two cultural traditions. So on one hand, in ancient pre-Hispanic Mesoamerica, which today would be central and southern Mexico, you had different indigenous peoples. I'm talking the Aztecs, the Mayans, who most people are familiar with, but other indigenous peoples that listeners may not be familiar with, like the Purépecha, the Zapotec, Mixtec, people of central and southern Mexico, had an annual essentially like a death ritual where they made altars for the dead, for their ancestors, etc. So that had been kicking around in Mesoamerica for thousands of years. Now, when Spain comes to colonize in the 1500s and they colonize Latin America, they're bringing over their Catholic traditions. And in the Catholic tradition, there had been for 1,000 years as well, this idea of All Saints and All Souls Day on November 2, where you remember all of those souls who have died and you pray for them, you make offerings for them, altars for them, etc. So already when you have this cultural contact or cultural clash between Spanish Catholicism and indigenous Mesoamerica, there were these two different death rituals which kind of combined in the 1500s and 1600s to give us this thing that we now call Dia de los Muertos, but it has both its tradition in the actual Mesoamerica, or today is Mexico, and in Europe.
Oh, that's great. I think a lot of individuals here in America, especially non-Latinos, see it as, it's a party.
Yeah.
You start digging in and you realize this is 1,000-year plus
Sure.
journey, if you will.
Yeah. It's really cool that it's a syncretic holiday, too, because it means that those people who were colonized, the indigenous people of Mesoamerica, had to find a way to keep their tradition alive. And they kept it alive by kind of mixing it with the colonizer's holiday to ensure that this thing continues. That's how meaningful it is. So when I talk about like the fact that it has like deep cultural significance, that's how significant it is. It's that when indigenous people were colonized, that they said, this is not something that we're going to lose. This is something we're going to keep. That's how meaningful it is to us. And we will find a way, even if it means blending it with those who have conquered us, we will find a way to keep it alive.
Thank you. That's a very good explanation. Now, let's kind of transition. It's the A to Z podcast.
Sure.
So obviously we're here in Arizona.
Sure.
Those of you listening cannot see it, but Dr. Sandoval came in an amazing Lucha Libre sugar sculpture. He has limited edition Day of the Dead Nikes on. So you rep it. I appreciate that from a fashion perspective and the history perspective.
No doubt.
But bringing it to Arizona, what were, I guess, some of those first stages? I'm sure, again, Mexican Americans in Arizona have been practicing this, but when did that start to formalize? When did we start seeing different organizations, dates, regions here in the state of Arizona.
In AZ specific, I love that. So one thing that I would like to clarify is like a common misconception, which is that Day of the Dead is and always has been celebrated by all Mexicans, which is not true. Like I said, it comes from Central and Southern Mexico. Now, Mexico, historically, is an incredibly large and diverse country. So not all people who are of Mexican descent have celebrated Dia de los Muertos. That said, in the early 20th century, as you have people migrating from Central and Southern Mexico into the U.S. Southwest, they're bringing their tradition with them. So Day of the Dead becomes somewhat popular among Mexican and Mexican-American communities in the early 20th century, but it's not publicly celebrated in large. That has a lot to do with the systemic racism of the U.S. I don't know how much you want to get into that, but I mean, as Mexican Americans are immigrating into the U.S., their culture isn't always received well. And so some of those things that are culturally significant have to kind of get tucked away or don't see the public light. That starts to change, of course, in the 1960s and 70s, thanks to the Chicano movement, the Mexican American Civil Rights Movement, in which Mexican Americans specifically begin to say, we don't care. This is a period of self-empowerment. We will let our culture be known. We're not afraid to celebrate it publicly. And so in the 1960s and 70s, you have in Arizona a lot of public celebrations of Dia de los Muertos. Now, that's not to say people hadn't been celebrating it privately, because Dia de los Muertos always has two components. One is a private component where you make an ofrenda or an altar for the dead within the home. And then there's the public celebration where you gather with the community, whether that's in the public plaza, community plaza, or in the graveyard, the cemetery, as a way to celebrate all of your dead communally. That's a huge, important part. It wasn't until the 60s and 70s that it became a public celebration here in Arizona. And I would say Tucson and Phoenix specifically. So one of the first Day of the Dead celebrations that takes place was actually in Mesa, started by Carmen and Zarco Guerrero, who still run a Dia de los Muertos celebration here in Phoenix. It's one of the longest standing Day of the Dead celebrations in the United States, actually. It's homegrown here in Mesa. That's been kicking around since the 1970s. The Tucson All Souls procession has been kicking around since the late 80s and early 1990s. So it's not really until the latter second half of the 20th century that Day of the Dead becomes more popular and publicly celebrated here in AZ.
Yeah, can you, when we were talking before the podcast, I brought up the All Souls procession. You said you have been engaged and been there.
Yeah.
Could you just give our listeners like a 30-second rundown of what happens there?
Sure.
What is the ambiance, the flavor, if you will?
Yeah, so I love the Tucson All Souls procession because it is the only Dia de los Muertos celebration in the U.S. that's specifically a procession. So as opposed to like a community gathering where you'll have music, you'll have performance, you'll have altar installations, etc., the entire Tucson All Souls procession is a mobile celebration. So people walk 2 miles processing through the streets, and as opposed to creating an altar that just sits on the street corner or sits in the home, you have to build it in a way that you can move it. So people become really creative with their designs for altars so that you have people making stuff that's on like a skateboard or something that's on like a shopping cart. Like how do you make something for somebody who has passed, but also are able to push it down the street for a couple miles and celebrate. It's also one of the largest celebrations in the United States of Dia de los Muertos, although they don't call it Dia de los Muertos, they just call it Tucson All Souls. Because it's Tucson, they want to have their own little stamp on it, which is cool. For those who know Tucson, it's very Tucson. I'll say that. It's got like an alternative kind of creative flair to it that you just don't find elsewhere.
That's very cool. Now, have you been to, we talked about Mesa, a GPEC community, so we're very happy to hear that.
Sure.
And one of the oldest. Anything else throughout the state? Have you been anywhere? I'm from up north, so.
Oh, yeah. There is recently some Dia de los Muertos celebrations in Flagstaff, but that's like recent, within like the last 10 years. And that's really in response to both Mexican migrants moving more and more into the Flagstaff region, but it's not like a long-standing tradition. One of the longer-standing ones actually is also in Mesa as well. The Mesa Arts Center hosts an annual Dia de los Muertos. Theirs is quite special too because it's a 2-day festival event as opposed to just like a one-time event. They do it over the course of a Saturday and Sunday where the entire thing is programmed with arts of all kinds, of course, because it's Mesa Arts Center. So it's got a huge artistic inflection, both with regards to like dance performances, theater performances, artistic demonstrations, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a very artistic, it's also like a very communal one too. And it's also a large celebration. Over the course of the 2 days, they get between 40 and 50,000 people arrive on the Mesa Arts Center campus to celebrate that thing. So it's beautiful in its own way too. And then the one that Carmen and Zarco Guerrero started originally in Mesa now lives here in Phoenix at the Phoenix Indian School Park and has been very inflected with the indigenous tradition, which is one of the reasons why they hold it at Phoenix Indian School Park as a way of honoring the meaning of that particular park, because of course that is where the Indian boarding school used to exist. And so it's a way of paying homage to in some sense, the beauty and the tragedy that exists with Indian boarding schools in the United States. And so that one has a very communal feel, but it's very much of an indigenous flavor, I would say, for sure.
No, that's good, discerning the differences between those. Now, you've, I'm sure, been to many of these events here, elsewhere. I love food.
Yeah.
I love celebration. I'm assuming there is a food and drink component and party atmosphere. Is it, you know, grilling up? Is it, are we like, what are we talking here?
Yeah, you know, what's been fantastic as I've watched Day of the Dead in the last 10 years specifically kind of explode culturally all over the United States, it really has become an opportunity for local foodies to get involved. So I would say one of the cool things is that at all of these, whether it's Mesa Arts Center, whether it's Tucson, you have like small food trucks showing up. So it's all very locally made. It's all like people who are small business owners who are crafting food for these events. If it's catered by a small business. Like, so Day of the Dead, I would say in some sense has always been commercial because there's always been a need to fulfill the desire for food, for drink, for objects, et cetera, et cetera. And so as Day of the Dead has grown, you also have like a very big kind of food flavor to it. So that in some sense, I would say, based on my own kind of interviews with people show up for Day of the Dead events maybe for the food first and really for the culture second, although of course food is culture as well.
So what's your go-to meat? Are you an al pastor guy, carne asada, machaca? Like what makes you tick?
Yeah, al pastor for sure. If I'm in Mexico City, that's all I'm on the hunt for. I have yet to find a good one, although there's a small shop, and I think there's a couple of them called El Mascadores, which is on Thomas, between like Central and 3rd Ave. They have a really killer pastor. Really, like, it's my go-to spot for that. But my partner is vegetarian, so finding meat is like, it's a rarity.
I feel you because my Mexican wife is vegan, but so many good spots.
Oh, of course.
Vegetarian and vegan, different, all kinds of different things. And you had brought up when we were originally talking about the roots in Mexico and kind of the multicultural aspect of, well, some colonizing, but some moving.
Sure.
And I always love how Al Pastor was kind of stems from some of the Turkish and whatnot immigrants in who were like, you know what you do? You slow roast something for about 2 days, then slice it up, and it's delicious.
100, because like, I think people sometimes forget this, is that when Spain colonized, the Spaniards who were coming over, it was a very multicultural society because Spain
owned everything.
They owned everything, but it was also made of North Africans. It was made of people who were coming from the Middle East, et cetera. So yeah, Spain was a variety of different things when they came to Latin America.
Okay, so you've hit on, the meaning and significance of Day of the Dead in some of your previous questions, but anything you want to hit again, I think listening to you, it's a two-front thing. It's remembrance and it is celebration.
Sure.
And we're going to move into kind of the current day commercialization, appropriation. But any other big picture things you think the audience should know, again, on that meaning and significance of Day of the Dead, no matter where it is?
Yeah. I would say, to me, I love Dia de los Muertos because it represents past, present, and future in very significant ways. So like, first of all, with the past being very obvious, those who have died, those who are your ancestors. It's a time of year to take stock of the past and honor the past. it's also an opportunity to stay present, right? That's the whole festivity aspect, is to live in the here and now. Live in the here and now right now, because we are alive. We're not dead yet, right? So that's the celebration component. The festive component of it is always driven by, damn, I've got blood coursing through my veins today that I can't say the same for the people who I'm honoring. So I've got to live it up today. That means I've got to eat the most. I've got to drink the most. I've got to dance the most. I've got to live it up today. And then future, in the sense that you can get very kind of metaphysical about this, which is to say that it's an acknowledgement that you and I, Tim, we will die, right? So it's a day of treating that seriously, but also with some comedy, maybe, like not being so self-serious, to know that in some rudimentary way, we are all connected in the sense that we all will die. That is what makes us human. That's what makes us beautifully human. And that's what makes us connected to every other human that exists on the planet.
I love it. It's symbiotic. You can't have life without death and one without the other.
Yeah, absolutely.
And this seems to acknowledge and celebrate it all.
Absolutely.
While not losing the past, not losing our lineage.
Yeah.
Which I think we as a society do pretty well now. We're so fast paced, move.
Mm-hmm.
And this really takes a look back.
Yep.
And I think that's hugely important for all cultures, but specifically this. Now, I want to move into kind of the last segment here, this commercialization of it, both good and bad.
Sure.
We were joking before the podcast. I said, once Day of the Dead is featured on a James Bond movie and he's running down the street and things are blowing up and you got sugar skulls everywhere.
Yes.
I was like, yeah, this is part of the culture,
Yep.
At this point. And so it was always funny to me because I remember sitting there in the theater seeing it going, oh, wow, okay, this is interesting.
Yes.
Now, that is very selfish. I love James Bond. So,
me too.
It's very selfish, but you've been in this game now a while. So what have you seen, again, good and bad,
Sure.
of that commercialization aspect?
Yeah, I will say that it is, for me, it's a good and bad scenario. And I have to say that because I have Nike Day of the Dead shoes on my feet right now.
Which I'm very jealous of.
Right? So on one hand, that is blatant commercialization. It's Nike saying, okay, we are going to use Day of the Dead as a way to sell sneakers. On the other hand, they've also done it in, I would say, a very ethically appropriate way, which is they hire Mexican designers to work on these shoes, people who are familiar with the culture. So it's not just, a team of white dudes in a room like
100%.
creating a sneaker. So that's important. I have been criticized in the past by other scholars, and this is fine. But for me, Day of the Dead has always been commercial. I said that earlier, because it's always been, like any other holiday, it's an opportunity to buy and sell things, right? That's true of even the ancient Aztecs, who for their death rituals would create elaborate markets where you had to buy all kinds of things, right? Even to make an altar in today, right? If I want to make an ofrenda for my grandmother who just passed a couple weeks ago, I'm going to have to go out and buy flowers. I'm going to have to go out and buy this, that, and the other thing. I'm going to have to spend money. And I'm going to have to rely on local merchants who sell that stuff in order for me to honor my ancestors in a traditional way, right? So that commerce and commercialization aspect has always been there. That has, of course, kind of gotten, I would say, somewhat problematic in the last maybe decade. In 2013, when Disney tried to literally trademark Dia de los Muertos, I was there in Burbank at the protests for that, because that seemed to be like, okay, you might have crossed the line there when you try and trademark this thing. Of course, the James Bond movie is in some sense a blatant commercialization. But the James Bond movie made Day of the Dead so internationally popular that, of course, Mexico City then said, oh, if people liked that Day of the Dead parade that they saw in the movie,
Come on down.
We will recreate that parade. And so now it's the largest Day of the Dead celebration in the world. I went to it last year. In 2022, they had 2 million people in the streets of Mexico City to celebrate that Day of the Dead parade, which is a James Bond parade. And in a decade from now, people are going to show up by the millions to celebrate in Mexico City, and they're going to forget that this started as a James Bond movie. It's going to become tradition. It'll become a traditional component of Day of the Dead.
Yeah, I would have loved to have seen the Google Trends the week that Spectre came out, because I have to imagine most of the world was Googling,
Yeah.
what is this? Well, what is Day of Dead?
Yes.
Skulls, explosions.
Yes.
And,
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the flip side of commercialization, of course, and I've written about this too, is that it keeps this tradition meaningful in a different way for another generation. So like just Coco as an example, to talk about Disney. Coco, of course, made Day of the Dead cool for a younger generation of Mexicans, Chicanos, and Latinos who may not have helped grandma make the altar. You know what I mean? Because like, it's an old person's thing. I don't want, but now it's Coco, right? It's Disney. It's cool. Like they want to be Miguel. So now they're helping grandma make the altar. Now they're more invested in their culture because they see themselves represented.
Yeah. And I wonder, non-Latinos, non-Chicanos, also watching, small kids probably going to their parents going, hey, I want to know more about this.
Yeah.
Like, what is
Why don't
this?
we have an altar?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's very interesting. Now, we do need to shift on probably some of the negative aspects of this. And one thing that we talked internally, I know I'm a white guy, probably know that if you know, of appropriation, because there is a fine line between acknowledging and supporting any movement and blatantly taking it over. You hit the Disney spot.
Yeah.
I remember that going, man, the mouse usually wins, but they might not win this one because this is a touchy subject.
Yeah.
You can't trademark a thousands-year-long celebration
No, not
of
at all.
every culture in Central and South America.
Yeah, yeah.
Central America, I should say.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the cultural appropriation, so it's nuanced and it's complicated. I don't want to treat it as if it's not nuanced and complicated because on one hand, you do have Day of the Dead has become trendy, especially like on social media, right? So you have people who like want to put a calaca face paint on and the makeup and dress up as like La Catrina and like look the part of Day of the Dead because it's cool and trendy and hip, et cetera, et cetera. And they have no understanding of what this holiday actually is. That exists. That to me is really troubling. That's a troubling sign. On the other hand, I would also say, as somebody who studied Day of the Dead celebrations in Mexico and in the US for the past decade, it is increasingly becoming a multicultural event. And so I have seen a growing number of people who are non-Latino show up. And that's not just white folks, that's African Americans, it's Asian Americans, et cetera, who are drawn to this, maybe because they don't have a cultural tradition of honoring ancestors. They don't have a way of dealing with death. I mean, in America, if you're an American citizen and you're socialized in this society, we don't have a good way of dealing with death. We like to deny death. We like to pretend it's not going to happen. We don't have a whole lot of cultural tools to help us deal with it. It's like you bury your dead, you attend the funeral, and then hope you're going to deal with this well, right? And so Dia de los Muertos, because it's an annual tradition, you have to revisit it every year so that you're constantly processing it in a way that I would say is healthy and healing. Dia de los Muertos, in that regard, I tend to think of as medicine. It really is cultural medicine. It's a way to heal from and deal with death, right? Not all cultures have that. And I've seen Day of the Dead become more popular for people because of that reason too, which I don't necessarily call appropriation. I would really kind of call that more cultural appreciation. People who come to this because they want to really use it as an opportunity to honor the ones that they've lost. That to me, I've seen grow in the last decade in very meaningful ways. I've seen Asian American people, African American people make incredible public altars for the people that they've lost in a way that I'm like, damn, that is meaningful. That's beautiful. I'm so glad that they did that. I'm not a hardliner who's like, it's not your culture, so therefore don't do it. I'm like, damn, they really use this as medicine, and that is what this holiday is.
And my 2 cents on this as the non-scholar, for anybody listening who is, we'll just say non-Latino, if you have to ask yourself, is this offensive based on your costume or face paint, just probably skip it.
Yeah.
Let's just go and support, go and enjoy it. But if you have to ask yourself, is this offensive? Probably is.
Probably is. And then the other, I mean, as Day of the Dead has gotten more trendy too, I've also seen more organizations, institutions, and businesses want to find a way to include Dia de los Muertos celebrations as part of their organization, and hold a Day of the Dead celebration. That to me has been really interesting. And in fact, some of my scholarly work has now become cultural work. So I do like cultural consulting for different organizations in the Valley to help them put on a Day of the Dead celebration in a way that's going to be culturally appropriate, and actually honor this tradition. So like right now I'm working with the Phoenix Children's Hospital. I'm working with the Phoenix Art Museum, a couple other local businesses as a way to like either install an altar or hold a Day of the Dead celebration in a way that's meaningful. That's not just like, hey, it's cool and trendy. Let's throw up an altar and we don't know what it is, but it'll look like Day of the Dead and it'll be cool.
No, that's a great answer. I appreciate that. And again, I think it's important that those organizations are reaching out to experts, reaching out to scholars. You had, rewinding a few minutes, you had talked about some of the design capabilities of like a Nike or whatever. And it's not just because I'm a Phoenix Suns season ticket holder and big Suns fan, but over the last year or two, the Suns have done a good job of honoring Indigenous and Latino culture by bringing in Indigenous and Latino culture creators and designers, and saying, to your point of like, it doesn't need to be 10 guys that look like me around a table designing something.
For sure.
They should reach out to the experts.
The Phoenix Suns have been fantastic about that. They really have. And I think as a basketball fan, I'm also really excited to see that, if for no other reason than they have like a Chicano icon. I don't know if he identifies as Chicano all the time, but Devin Booker.
Oh, he absolutely does.
You know, I mean, like he does because he's got those low riders, right, that he pulls into the Sun Stadium. But like they have one of the most iconic Mexican-American basketball players on the planet. Like they should have some kind of Dia de los Muertos tie-in as a way of saying this is the centerpiece of our team, although KD might have something to say about that.
No, Devin Booker's absolutely the centerpiece of the team. But yes, I agree. And hey, I'm hearing an opportunity. I think you need to reach out to the Suns and go advise Devin Booker.
Oh my God.
To me, that seems like a pretty easy next step for you.
Yeah, transition from ASU to the Phoenix Suns. I would love that.
Okay, so we're going to wrap up here in a minute. We're at right around 30 minutes. And again, we just greatly appreciate your analysis, your expertise. It's very engaging. A last question here, looking forward. What are your thoughts as this, we'll just say event, but this celebration moves forward? You know, where do you see it going, or where would you like to see it go?
Here is where I see it going. I see it going into a decade from now. We will really reach a threshold with which we have to call this now a North American holiday, as opposed to just a Mexican or Central American celebration. And I say that because Day of the Dead celebrations are popping up all over the United States and Canada and the UK in some regard. But just if we're talking about North America, it's spreading all over North America. And not just because of immigrant populations and migration patterns of Latinos and Mexicans across the United States and Canada, although that's a big part of it. You also have more and more savvy businesses, organizations, institutions who just acknowledge that, like, we are selling stuff to a Latino market. How do we pay homage to the people who we're trying to incorporate into our community or into our business, et cetera? So Day of the Dead is really becoming American, like Stars and Stripes kind of American. I really mean that. Like last year was the first year that an ofrenda was installed in the White House.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
Yeah. So Jill Biden, the president's wife, because she's a scholar, right? Dr.
Biden. Yeah,
Jill
Dr. Biden.
Dr. Jill Biden, because she's savvy, she knows this culture. She understands what it is. She reached out to a Mexican-American artist in Chicago who makes altars and who runs the Dia de los Muertos celebration in Chicago. She brought him to the White House to install an altar in honor of all of the Latino and Chicano staff who run the White House, right? Because the White House isn't just white anymore, right? The White House is multicultural, and it's filled with Latinos who want to celebrate Dia de los Muertos. And so now the White House is offering a Day of the Dead celebration and building altars. I mean, when the U.S. government starts to get involved, I'm like, okay, this is increasingly becoming very American.
Yeah, you hit on that. I was just at the Datos report 2 weeks ago talking about the economic impact of Latinos in Arizona, and internally, this is the Greater Phoenix Economic Council. We study these trends, and you and I before the podcast were talking about other cultural things, pro wrestling, music, etc., who are making, in my opinion, good faith efforts of, hey, there's this large audience, and they are going to be the most impactful audience moving forward. Based on growth and youth and everything. And so some of these entities, again, you said cultural appreciation, not appropriation, of really reaching out and saying there's a lot of Latinos or you can use Hispanic for, South America, but basically there's a large population.
100.
And bringing them in is probably a good idea.
and it's only going to grow, right? I'm sure that's what the trend said, is that this is only going to grow. And I think as that happens, our culture is also going to grow in beautiful ways, in ways that are also going to present problems, of course, because growth of any kind presents problems. It's also going to grow in ways that are beautiful and meaningful and significant.
And I'm assuming you will be astutely following any bad actors in this moving forward and supporting the good actors.
100, but always as a way not to call out, but to call in, right? So like if I find bad actors, it's like, yo, why don't you reach out to us? Let us help you make this meaningful for your organization, for your business, et cetera.
No, that's great. Dr. Sandoval, we're at the end here. I want to thank you. This has been incredible. Your knowledge. This could go on for probably 2 more podcasts, but we wanted to keep this in a nice digestible amount.
Sure.
I know anything come up in the near future, we would love to call you and have you come in, especially with an arts and culture focus. And we will be tagging you, any social media handles, because I know you have a fairly long list of publications and papers and books. And so we definitely, for any followers, we will make sure we post that on the blog. So again, greatly appreciate. And just to the listeners, do me and Dr. Sandoval a favor. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast on your favorite podcast listening app. And if you're so inclined, we'd love for you to rate us 5 stars. To keep up with what's happening in Greater Phoenix, please follow GPEC at Greater Phoenix on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, or X as it's called, and YouTube. And until next time, be safe and well. Cheers.